Good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us on our weekly AJA Zoom event, and welcome to any new people that may be watching us for the first time. I'd also like to welcome any people from our communal organisations who may be watching, and we hope you enjoy the session. We also have people watching on Facebook and some who listen to the audio replay, which is broadcast every Thursday at midday and Sundays at 4 p.m. on J-Air Community Radio. That's at FM 88 in Melbourne, or at www.j-air.com.au. So welcome to you all. My name is Alan Friedman. I'm Vice President of the Australian Jewish Association, and you will also have seen David Adler, who's the President of the AJA. And we've been chatting with our guest tonight, who is Olga Deutsch from Ngo Monitor. She's actually happens to be in Serbia at the moment, which is where she's from. The topic, of course, is the way terrorist organisations make use of the various NGOs. The format tonight will be an interview-style discussion, and then we'll have questions. And as I mentioned, for those that are not familiar, if you want to ask a question, we do ask you to raise your hand electronically. That way we know that you're interested in asking a question, and we can enable you to unmute yourself. You do that by clicking on the reactions button at the bottom and then raising your hand. Written questions can be placed on the chat function. The chat function can be disabled if you want to. Robert Gregory is our Director of Public Affairs and will read some of the written questions out during question time. Okay, a couple of weeks ago, IDF troops confiscated property and welded shut the doors of offices of several Palestinian advocacy groups in Ramallah after the Defence Minister ratified a 2021 decision to outlaw groups over alleged ties to the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. This triggered the expected backlash from the Palestinian Authority, the European Union, progressive US Democrats, and the Jewish useful idiot groups in the United States. The Defence Ministry responded by claiming that these organisations in question, quote, operate undercover for the PFLP and work under the guise of performing humanitarian activities to further the goals of the PFLP terror organisation. We know the Palestinian advocacy groups make good use of a range of NGOs who are happy to criticise Israel at every opportunity, but how much of a problem is this really for Israel, and what's being done about it? To answer these questions and shed some light on the issue, we're joined by Olga Deutsch from Ngo Monitor, which we know well and have a lot of respect for. Olga is a graduate of the University of Belgrade and the University of Munich, working in Israel advocacy from being the chairperson of the European Union of Jewish Students to a range of senior positions in the private sector in Europe and Israel. In 2008, Olga received the International Leadership Prize from the American Jewish Committee. Olga, thank you for joining us, and a big welcome to the Australian Jewish Association via Zoom.
Well, thank you very much, Alan, and thank you, David, for having me, and greetings to everyone joining us tonight. It is an immense pleasure for me every time I get the chance to engage with the Australian Jewish community. It is really an honor.
Okay, Olga, let's start by casting our minds back. So 3 years and 1 week ago, 17-year-old Israeli Rina Schnurb was killed by a roadside bomb while hiking with her father and brother near Modi'in, and they were injured, for which 3 PFLP members were arrested. So what's the significance of this, and how does the story develop from there?
So that's exactly the point. The fact that in the middle of what here is a summer, right? In August, which tends to be the slow month politically and media-wise and so on, we all of a sudden saw a lot of action and a lot of activity. From beginning of August, we saw a big statement being issued by 9 European countries, their foreign ministries, basically siding with the Palestinian NGOs and against a designation by the Israeli Ministry of Defense from back in 2021, and all the way to the Israeli Ministry of Defense ratifying the decision a month ago. And all this activity is for a reason, because as you said, last week we marked the 3rd anniversary since the terror attack in which a 17-year-old Rina Schnur was killed. That was not the first terror attack, sadly, that we in Israel endured, nor is Rina the only or the first teenage victim of a terror attack. But there is something that is very unique and particular about this terror attack and Rina's murder. And that is the fact that her name has been dragged ever since in Israeli and international media, and that we don't seem to be able to put her to proper rest and to send the perpetrators, the terrorists, who are allegedly responsible for her murder, into the rightful place, which is prison, right, and characterize them as terrorists. And the only reason for this is that amongst the 50 PFLP cell members that the Israeli security forces arrested shortly after the murder, at least 5 were senior officials, employees on a payroll in senior positions, financial director, CEO, general director, and so on, of 5 Palestinian so-called human rights and humanitarian NGOs. Now, it takes a moment. We need to stop, we need to pause just to sort of understand the gravity of this. We have what everyone thinks is a group of human rights groups that are supposed to, as the Europeans believe and entrust them with, promote human rights, sustainable development, building a democracy and a vibrant civil society in the Palestinian society. And instead, these individuals are charged by the Israelis by playing senior roles in the terror attack. And the senior roles, one of them was actually charged with detonating the explosive. The other one was in charge of recruiting and training the whole cell. So they also took senior role in the terror attack. The particular thing is that all these NGOs at the moment of the terror attack were funded and by and large supported, because the funding is only one part of the support, by the European Union and many other European governments through their official development and aid programs. It is important to understand the context. Ever since after the Second World War, the Europeans believe and have believed that building a vibrant civil society is pivotal for maintaining peace, because they understand that critical and vibrant civil society should serve as a moral compass, if you will, to the governments, right? They should hold the elected officials accountable. And in that capacity, and much unlike is the case in North America or in Australia, where we have individuals and businesses supporting charities, there is no such tradition in Europe, so the governments took on that role on themselves. And ever since the Second World War, the European governments have spent billions of euros and dollars in supporting civil society, both inside and outside of Europe. And such is the case also in the Palestinian Authority, where the Europeans believe that if they continue investing in the civil society, the return on investment will be a vibrant civil society and accountable PA. Now, most of us acquainted with the reality on the ground would at best question this, but the Europeans firmly believe in this, which is why their reaction to the Israeli government arresting the so-called NGO leadership and activists was severe, and their initial reaction was criticism. They charged Israel with shrinking civil space for the Palestinians, with not allowing those who criticize also the PA to freely function and so on. And they demanded proof from the Israelis. Now, it took a while. The terror attack took place in August 2019. In December 2019, the Israeli security forces announced the names of the terrorists that were arrested. And only in October 2021 did the Israeli government actually designate the NGO. So this has been an ongoing process, but one thing is a constant, and that is that the European governments have continuously sort of rejected the Israeli claim that these NGOs serve as a PFLP network. I'll stop here because I know that you have a lot of questions. I could continue, you know, to unfold this story.
That's okay. So Olga, can the Europeans not see that the Palestinians have no interest in building a functioning society? I mean, everybody else can see that. What is the problem with the Europeans in this regard?
Well, it's sort of a catch-22. First of all, it's important to shed a light on the activities of these NGOs. We're talking actually about a full-blown network. We have identified, we at Ngo Monitor, because that's what we do. We are a research organization and we map out these groups and their activities on one hand, and on the other hand, we track the funding, where their funds come from. We have identified a 13 NGOs network affiliated to PFLP. PFLP is a terror group designated as such by Israel, obviously, but also by the European Union, the US, and Canada. So all these governments consider PFLP to be as a terror group. The Israelis have designated so far 8, 6 in the last round, right, in October 2021, and 2 additional members of this PFLP NGO network shortly before that. Now, it was a very smart thing by PFLP to do. And it's important to understand how this network even came about. PFLP, unlike other groups in the Palestinian society, is not a religious group. PFLP is a Marxist, so communist group that is secular, right? Their members are secular. And after the Oslo Accords, for cultural reasons, it was very comfortable for the Europeans to work with the members of the PFLP because they had no dietary restrictions. They had women amongst their activists, which fit the profile of what a free, democratic, vibrant civil society should look like that the Europeans have. And at the same time, PFLP is also a political party in the Palestinian authorities. So they already had access to all the relevant circles, and it was easy for them to befriend the Europeans. And this is how the whole partnership sort of was born. Now, most of these groups have taken one particular human right issue and created an organization around that. So you'll have one NGO that promotes children's rights, right, and their right to access to services. The other group has taken the women's rights and allegedly, right, on paper promotes women's rights. The biggest of the NGOs and the one that enjoyed the most funding from the European governments, the Union of Agricultural Work Committees, as its name says, was supposed to allow Palestinian farmers and agricultural workers access to better services on the ground and liaison between them and the government in major infrastructural agricultural projects and so on and so on. What they do in practice, actually, is blame everything and anything on the occupation in Israel. So it's sort of a paravan, right, for anti-Israel activities. Their most famous and biggest leader, Al-Haq, right, who is also internationally regarded as the most prominent Palestinian human rights group, is the leader in accusing Israel of being apartheid. And is a leader in filing submissions to the International Criminal Court, calling for the ICC in The Hague to prosecute Israeli soldiers and politicians and so on. And we just marked yesterday 125 years since the creation of the Zionist movement, right? The first Zionist Congress in Basel. It is that same group of NGOs that actually accused the entire Zionist movement of being a racist endeavor, which on its own deserves a pause. In today's environment where there is no worse thing, if you think about it, than being called a racist. And this is exactly what they blame us for. So for the Israeli side, these groups are very toxic, right? And they promote delegitimization of Israel, lawfare against Israel. They call for boycott against Israel. But at the same time, the Europeans traditionally support them as the main partner for promoting the human rights and humanitarian causes. Just to get your mind around that, in the last 10 years, the EU and other European governments have provided at least 200 million US dollars to these 13 NGOs. Now, for anyone who understands the local context, that someone can understand how much money that is. The dissonance is palpable. Now, Europeans, think about it. The more they support them, the more important for them it is to continue reporting what a tremendous and important work these NGOs are doing, right? The more projects that the Palestinians group filed for with the European governments, the more projects they come up with to continue receiving and increasing the funding. So it's sort of a catch-22 for the Europeans because they don't want to lose their years-long partners, and they don't want to admit that potentially they were wrong. Now, there is also a battle inside of Europe between the administrations and the parliamentarians. And I don't know if we can go into that, because that is part of the sort of the next part of the conversation, and that is what has happened on the European side since the murder of Rina Schnurb.
I wanted to ask you about something. This may be what you're alluding to, but back in February this year, the umbrella organisation of over 135 Palestinian organisations hosted an EU-funded conference, and this was attended by the head of the EU delegation to the West Bank and Gaza, a man by the name of Sven Bergstad. So what was this all about? Who is he, and what does it all mean?
So this is exactly what I was alluding to, as you said, this schism, sort of, or dissonance inside of Europe. We've been seeing sort of a war between the administration and the elected officials. Now, we at NGO Monitor have a little something to do about that, because following the murder and the announcement of the arrested terrorists, right? Once we found out that a big chunk of the terrorists were leaders of human rights NGOs supported by the EU and other European governments, we launched a massive campaign in Europe. Some of it was public and some of it was not, meaning that we simply shared information with elected officials, both in Brussels, in the European Parliament, but also in The Hague and in Berlin and in Spain and in other European capitals, to alert them that public funds, taxpayers' money, it's important to say that, are being provided to terror-affiliated NGOs. So these officials started writing letters, started asking parliamentary questions, started raising this issue in the meetings of foreign affairs committees and other forums in the parliament. And the administration and the leadership was now in a place where they needed to provide answers. This massive campaign, coupled with tremendous media coverage of the issue, because we've been alerting to the toxic and radical language used by these NGOs. And actually, just a few months short of the terror attack, Professor Gerald Steinberg, our president, and myself presented a paper at the International Counter-Terror Conference saying exactly that. We said, let us not wait for this language to escalate to an actual physical violence, because when you see these groups radically sort of growing or escalating their language, it is to assume that it will not finish with language. Now, consequently, after this massive attention that was being given to the issue and the fact that a teenage girl was murdered by human rights activists, 3 governments launched internal investigations into potential diversion of public funds to terror through NGOs. That was mind-blowing on its own, because never in the past, until then, did any European government allow itself to put the word NGO in the same sentence with terror. So that on its own was a deal breaker. The EU, consequently, froze funding to the 3 NGOs that they were financially supporting, pending investigation. They haven't concluded the investigation yet. The Dutch government, not trusting anyone else, they hired an independent consulting company that took a year and a half and had multiple field trips to Israel and to Ramallah, interviewed NGOs, collected information, and amazingly, a year and a half later, they concluded that based solely on public publicly available information, that basically means Googling, right? They found that this one NGO that the Dutch government funded had more than 34 activists with double positions. That means that at the same time, they held senior positions inside the NGO, either serving as on their payroll or on their boards, and on senior positions in the PFLP. And that based on this, the Dutch government should stop funding. And they did. The foreign minister and the development minister presented these findings to the parliament. And
we've just lost your audio for a moment.
Can you hear me?
Now we can, yes, terrific.
Yeah,
Go on,
sorry.
please.
So the Dutch government canceled their contract to these groups. The German government, in the beginning of this year, in January, the foreign minister of Germany visited Israel, and in a press conference with our back then foreign minister Yair Lapid, announced that the German government will continue supporting Palestinian NGOs, but without engaging with the six. Now, that is a lot of developments, and in between, the Israeli government designated 6 groups, which made it even a bigger issue. But going back to your question, and it is important to say this, we have identified more than 80 individuals across these 13 groups that serve on dual positions, both at PFLP and in NGOs. All our information is based on open source information. Again, that is just a fancy word for Googling, which means that these governments should have been able to vet them, to check who they're working with, right? And that is the core issue. Now, the schism that I keep referring to is basically whether the elected officials who are trying to hold their administrations and ministries accountable will win the debate and A, sanction these groups, and B, make sure that there are better vetting procedures that should ensure that no such group anywhere in the world, right, not only amongst the Palestinian NGOs, will get public funds again. Or will the administration be stronger that is continuously trying to side with the Palestinian NGOs because parts of them are really that ideologically pro-Palestinian, and the other part just doesn't want to change the status quo. We've been working with these groups for 20 years, and we should continue to do that. We trust them.
But do they actually see any results coming from this association? I mean, if so, what are they?
Well, that's an excellent question, and one that we never receive the answer. Right? We always say, how do you measure the success? Yeah. What are the KPIs, right? And they will continuously talk about raising awareness and the occupation, as if the occupation, or should we say the lack of a peace agreement, right, between Israel and the Palestinian Authority is the reason that women's rights are not properly promoted in the Palestinian Authority, or that children don't have access to health care, or that the Palestinian Authority continues to pay salary to Palestinian prisoners, right, security prisoners who perpetrate terror attacks, or that the entire society is geared to incite against Jews. Because when they set to detonate an explosive, they don't know if it's a Jewish tourist or a Christian tourist or an Israeli settler, as they call. It is an indiscriminate terror attack. So it is a very convenient solution for the Palestinian Authority, because they hide all the real issues that should be dealt with in trying to build a society and a country behind the occupation, if you'd like.
Yeah. Olga, we're talking about the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Why are we talking about this particular organisation and no others, or are there other Palestinian terror groups involved?
There are other terror groups involved. The EU list of restrictive measures, which is basically the EU terror list, includes 7 Palestinian groups on it. But what is particular about PFLP is that it is the only one that has its own NGO network. Now, terror groups abusing charities is not a new phenomenon. In counter studies, that is a very common phenomenon. You will have mosques serving as the frontier, right, for raising funds, for recruiting, for incitement, for training, and so on. You will have all kinds of charity groups working with children and so on that seemingly seem very naive, but that are actually operated by the terror groups. What is unique in particular about PFLP is that these NGOs are not just charities. They're human rights and humanitarian NGOs that raise their funds from governments. So that is the core issue here, right? We're not talking just about any terror or radical event here. We're talking about the most blatant abuse of what is supposed to be the cleanest, right? The most noble, right, activity, which is protecting the weak, protecting the underrepresented, right? And doing that through raising funds from the governments. Now, we keep talking about the funds, right? And it's a lot of money. Without this money, they would not be able to operate. But the real issue here is not the funds. It is the legitimacy and the platform that they're being given by working and partnering with NGOs. Just think about that. When Sven von Bosdorf, right, the EU ambassador to Ramallah that you mentioned earlier, comes to the event organized by PFLP NGO network, or when these groups are able to put the logo of the Dutch government or the German government, right, on their activities, that goes far beyond the financial aspect of the issue. Their narrative, this violent, hateful, discriminatory, and yes, dangerous anti-Israel narrative is being completely whitewashed and legitimized. It is being given audience that doesn't know better and assumes that if more than one government supports this, then they must be doing something right.
So the various governments that are giving these NGOs money are really spending a lot of money to make themselves feel better, because the end result is that it doesn't actually help the people at the other end who it's supposed to help. Is that right?
I think that is the biggest tragedy of this entire situation. I always say when I engage with European and other officials, even if there was no resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Israeli citizens still live in a secure, thriving democracy. We are free to travel, to send our children to school. We enjoy a beautiful life. But it is the Palestinian mother, sitting on the other side to my home, right, just a few kilometers away from me, who is being robbed of those same opportunities of living in a free, vibrant democracy. Instead of having these groups hold the Palestinian Authority accountable for not providing services, for not building a society, everything and anything is being blamed on the occupation and on Israel. So if you'd like, it is the gravest betrayal of the Palestinian people before we even view it as a waste and abuse of European taxpayer money, or a security threat to Israel, or just a machine, an industry, an NGO industry seeking to delegitimize and attack Israel, or basically delegitimize the right of Israel to exist as a Jewish democracy, because all of them promote a one-state solution approach, which basically means that they don't want a Jewish state there.
Okay, just one more from me, and then we'll go to questions. Where does the Palestinian Authority fit into all of this? Are they just spectators, or are they interfering and manipulating behind the scenes?
Well, there is no, let's just put it out there. Palestinian Authority is not a democracy, and there is no thriving, civil, and free society. So these groups, in order to be able to operate, they have to cooperate with the Palestinian Authority. Palestinian Authority has a whole branch that coordinates with these groups. Now they play a game according to what is more fitting. So when one of these groups criticizes the PA, then they will issue a critical statement against them. But when the Israeli government designated these groups, they all stood together in condemning this. They designated NGO Monitor as a sign of retaliation. When the Israeli government designated the 6 NGOs as terror groups, they designated NGO Monitor as a terror group. So even if I wanted to, with my Serbian passport, I don't think I will be able to visit the Palestinian Authority anytime soon, because I might get arrested as a terrorist. But it is a farce, right? And it is just a betrayal of Palestinian people before anything else.
Yeah. Okay, we'll go to questions in just a moment, but if you're listening on J-Air, this is the Australian Jewish Association Zoom event, which we have every Wednesday night. Our guest tonight is Olga Deutsch. She's from NGO Monitor in Israel, and we're talking about the terrorist use of NGOs. Just before questions, I'll hand back to David to give us a brief insight into what's happening next week.
Okay, thank you very much, Alan. I just want to show the audience and Olga that one of our greatest themes, and indeed one of our signature achievements, is to reform the way Australian foreign aid has been delivered. I'm showing now the cover of a Spectator magazine. As you can see, there's a Jewish man lying in a pool of blood, and stabbed into his back is an Australian $100 note. And the question asked at the bottom here is our foreign aid funding terror? That was part of a campaign that successfully made some reforms to Australian foreign aid. But to Alan's point specifically, firstly, as we always do, if you're not yet doing something active to support AJA, then please, after this event, go to the website, jewishassociation.org.au. You can make a donation, you can apply for membership. Make sure you like and follow the AJA Facebook page, in particular for daily updates of news and views. Now, if you're into political correctness, don't log on next week, because we are dealing with the subject of Europe's multicultural volcano, with a terrific Italian journalist and commentator, Giulio Meotti, and he calls things out absolutely clearly and bluntly about some of the trends that are happening, particularly with the major Islamic immigration into Israel. And finally, for those in Melbourne in particular, we have AJA represented at Limud Oz. The time slot is 10 a.m. Sunday, the 4th of September, when Alan Friedman and Michael Bird will be talking about AJA and relationships in the Jewish community more broadly.
Thanks, David. Yes, that will be one little flash of common sense in a whole sea of woke insanity, Michael. So that will be you and I on Sunday morning. Okay, it's time for questions. We'll start off with Ron, Ruben and Michael. So Ron, you are first. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Okay, Ron, off you go.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Oh, thanks. Thank you, Olga, for your wonderful presentation. Europe is going through a very big period of uncertainty at the moment with regard to energy supplies, and Israel has some leverage in terms of energy, intelligence sharing, and cyber technology, exactly what the Europeans need at this point of time. Why does Israel not use its leverage now to deal with the Europeans, which clearly are in some respects a hostile entity? because it seems to be going around in circles as to Israel explaining, giving the evidence, but getting basically silly excuses and turning a deaf ear to what's going on. Why does Israel not use leverage to try and change the dynamics as to what's going on?
Okay, that's a very interesting question. It is important to say that we tend to deal with issues that are that concern us, right, and that pain us. And when it comes to soft power that Europe and the European Union and Europe exude, Israel is righteously and should be very critical, because what is being promoted, right, through the civil society, through NGOs, and through this whole politically correct discourse, right, and human rights discourse, Israel is being constantly criticized, and not only verbally, but right, their actions and lawfare against Israel, and the civil society, the human rights community is being allowed, that the European governments are supporting, right, and catering for, serving as a platform for, is a fertile ground for this anti-Israel language. But we need to understand that at the same time, in the same breath, the EU is Israel's greatest trade partner, not the US, but the EU. And there are thriving relationships between Israel and the EU and the individual European countries and Israel. And there are different sides to that coin, right? So we have to, I assume I cannot speak on behalf of the Israeli government because I'm not a governmental official. I can simply offer my analysis as someone who understands Europe and has dedicated most of my career to Europe and Europe-Israel relations, that the Israeli government has to carefully tiptoe, right, while promoting one issue and exchange on science, on technology development and innovation, on trade, on security cooperation, and on the other side, issues such as security or softer issues, which is basically what we are discussing today, and that is the delegitimization against Israel, BDS, and so on. An additional challenge is the whole discussion about anti-Semitism, right? The Europeans, but not only, the entire world, and I know that there is an ongoing discussion in Australia as well surrounding the IHRA, the IHRA, working definition on anti-Semitism, right? There's an ongoing discussion. What is anti-Semitism? Now, even if you ask 3 Jews, they will have 3 different answers to that question. But the traditional understanding is a very comfortable one also for governments. There is a consensus in condemning what we know as the far right, right? Extreme neo-Nazi anti-Semitism. But the governmental officials and public figures are not equally comfortable, and not all of them, and some completely reject, that anything that has to do with Israel can and should be qualified as anti-Semitic, right? Calling for Israel's destruction, or simply not recognizing Israel's right to exist as a Jewish democracy, or blaming you in Melbourne for something that the Israeli government has done, although you don't have an Israeli passport, and so on and so on. So these issues of delegitimization of Israel, BDS, and claiming that Israel is apartheid, they fall exactly in the center of this discussion. Now, the EU is leading a very vocal actually campaign. They have a coordinator on combating anti-Semitism that is pioneering, promoting the IHRA working definition on anti-Semitism, which basically marries the 2 types of anti-Semitism, the old one and the more contemporary one, which is the anti-Israel geared one. But there is a big gap between them making this as a declaration and implementing it, because it means translating it, trickling it down to the different levels of the society, not just the broader public, but you need to train the police officers so that they know when they make an arrest, whether that was a hate crime or just another criminal act, right? You need to train the judges so that they know whether they're prosecuting a hate crime again or not. You need to train the teachers when there is an incident in a school, right? So that a teacher knows how to deal with it. So that not only when a Jew is called, in a connection to the protocols of Zion, or is being blamed for, the global Jewish conspiracy, rather when they're called Zionists, or, a fifth column because of their connection to Israel, that too is an anti-Semitic incident. So it is a very long answer to a complex question. I am sure that the Israeli government is using this as a leverage, but again, it is interesting to note that, for example, the ratification of the designation by the Israeli Ministry of Defense of the designation of the 6 Palestinian NGOs as terror groups came weeks after the 7 European governments issued a shocking statement that they are siding with the Palestinian NGOs and that they have not seen enough information and proof from the Israelis that these groups are terror fronts. And if you look at it as an isolated event, then you might say, why has it taken the Israeli government such a long time to defend its own position? But if you look at it in a slightly broader context, and you understand that the foreign ministers of the 27 EU member states were exactly then deliberating whether to renew the EU-Israel association agreement, which in itself includes regulating every aspect of the EU-Israel cooperation, which is a multi-billion euros worth deal, then you need to understand why Israelis waited. Because the government wanted this decision, this association agreement renewed and ratified, and only after that they wanted to bring up a more critical issue that they don't necessarily agree with the Europeans. So
Okay.
it really is tiptoeing around this
yes.
multitude of issues.
Thanks, Olga. Now, Michael was next, and then we'll take a couple of written questions from Robert. Michael, please unmute yourself. Good.
Yeah, Olga, I'd like to talk to you about, I have a problem with Australia and Australian providing funds or indirectly to some of these NGOs. We know about World Vision. We know that Mohammed Halabi through World Vision has been arrested and I think jailed for funneling funds to Hamas, and Australians support World Vision. But a bigger problem within the Jewish side of things is the New Israel Fund, which I believe has supported many of these NGOs that Israel has targeted. They're against the IRA definition. They're also lobbying the government at the moment, the new left-wing government, to recognise the Palestinian state. What do you say to the Jewish community in Australia that are funding this, what I consider an anti-Zionist progressive organisation, New Israel Fund? What do you say to people that are funding them?
Well, it's an excellent question, and this is exactly what I was in Australia in March, beginning of March, and I had a pleasure to also sit down with both elected MPs in the Parliament in Canberra, but also in Sydney on the local and regional level, and the IRA working definition and what to do with it and how to actually instrumentalize it was the central part of our discussion. And in every conversation, couple of issues came up, which is the campuses and the hateful discourse that is happening on Australian campuses surrounding Zionism in Israel and how Jewish students are being targeted and continuously they feel unwelcome and unsafe. And the issue of the New Israel Fund that is basically providing to Israel critical MPs a green card, right? A free pass to say, well, here are my Jews. My Jews say that your definition is not okay, that when you promote the IRA working definition that says that being anti-Zionist is that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. My bunch of Jews, which is the New Israel Fund, say that that's not true, and you're free to be anti-Zionist. So it is a problem that we see across North America as well, and I'm very I'm disappointed and worried that it is now also very present in Australia as well. But I would like to say that there is no discussion actually whether the IRA working definition is the only and the most relevant definition. And I think we need to treat it as such. There will always be attempts to dispute it or to come up with an alternative one. There's an attempt, it is called the Jerusalem Declaration. There was an attempt by not more and not less, but German academics of all countries to come up with an alternative definition on what constitutes anti-Semitism as a reaction to the IRA working definition. But the fact is that over 30 governments, including the EU that represents 27 on its own, right, have adopted the IRA working definition and are implementing it. The key word is not adopting it, because that is merely a demonstrative, declarative act. The key issue is, what do you do? What does a government do with it afterwards? And for example, the EU has adopted a couple of years ago a guide on how to practically implement the IRA working definition across different policy areas: judicial system, the interior affairs, which is police and everything, schools and academia, right, the educational system, civil society, which means NGOs, and so on. And this is what Australia should do as well. It should start on the level of the national parliament. There should be a national strategy on combating anti-Semitism that should be adopted, and it should evolve around the IRA working definition as the way to filter what is anti-Semitic and what is not. The IRA working definition clearly states that criticizing the state of Israel is not anti-Semitic. You can engage in a discussion that is critical of Israel. It is okay for anyone to say, I disagree with this or that policy of the state of Israel. But applying double standards against the Israel that you would not apply against any other government, any other country, is anti-Semitic. Or arguing that Israel doesn't have a right to exist as a Jewish democracy is anti-Semitic. And then that national strategy should be translated on regional and municipal levels, so that over the years, it is a long process, right? But we have to start somewhere, so that it should trickle down on different levels of the society and administration.
We have talked about the IRA definition quite a lot here in Australia. Just before we go to Robert, look, I'll take a question from Cheryl and then Peter, and then we'll go to Robert. So Cheryl, please unmute yourself and ask the question that I think you put on the chat.
Thank you so much, Lynn. I really appreciate it. Tonight especially, because I had an operation yesterday and I've been suffering with sickness for the last year, I am a bit emotional, so please forgive me. Now, I fight the lies by running a number of educational Facebook groups to educate Jews. But I am now feeling totally overwhelmed that we are losing the propaganda war. I'm constantly attacked, even if I go on a post by the Premier, and told that I'm backing terrorists and that we're killing Palestinians. Why are we not better resourced? How can they beat us in the propaganda war with lies?
And then presumably you're talking about Israel, Cheryl. I mean, does Israel devote enough resources to fighting all of this stuff, especially online? What do you think, Olga?
So Cheryl, first of all, refuah shlema, feel better. I hope you will recover quickly and fully. And thank you for joining us despite the fact that you had a surgery only yesterday. And thank you for all the work that you are doing. It is important that you know that all of us in Israel appreciate every piece of support anywhere in the world, and we don't take it for granted. Now, you're asking a very big question, and I'll try to give as good of an answer as I can. I think it is important that Israel, the government, does not get involved too much Okay, we have a plethora of NGOs in Israel, and you know most of them are supported by NIF, right? Ranging from B'Tselem and Breaking the Silence and Adala and so on. That are they're the leaders of the anti-Israel discourse, right? They grant legitimacy to the other side because again, the other side will say, well, look, it's the Israeli NGOs, the Jews themselves are saying these things. B'Tselem was the first one before Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch to issue a report accusing Israel of apartheid. But it is important that the Israeli government does not apply restrictive measures against them. As horrific as it is, and I have dedicated my professional life to fighting these groups, right? But at the same time, and I think this is something that is very important to say also to all those accusing you, we are proud of having a vibrant democracy in which a Breaking the Silence activist and I have the same access to public space, to funding, to the public, and we get to fight on the same stage and in the same media over our ideas, but in a respectful manner. The battle should be amongst us, the organizations, and where do we, who has the better argument. Now, it is the arguments that are what makes our side struggle, and I'll try to explain. The other side has no checks and balances whatsoever, right? Take any action that the Israeli military has taken in the Gaza, right, over the last couple of wars. You would have an image that is a lie. It would be an image from Aleppo or from Turkey, of a child, go around the world in a matter of an hour and being presented that it's a Palestinian child that is being killed by the Israeli army. By the time the IDF debunks this, proves, vets the image, and then goes public to say that it is a false picture, it has nothing to do with Israel or the war in Gaza, the news already made their thing. They went around the world. And so the challenge is, but we need to own it and be proud of it, is that we do not spread lies. We vet our information. We consult our legal advisors before we say something. It takes us at NGO Monitor a few months to issue a report after we concluded the research, because we need to write it responsibly. We need to have our legal advisors check every word so that we are not sued for libel, right? And that we're not saying something that is not accurate before we go public. They don't do the same. They spread lies or distorted truths because they play on the emotional reaction, an instant emotional reaction by the people who are ignorant. They have never been to Israel. They don't know history. They are being fed. I'm sorry, it's around hour. The clock is ringing. They're being fed lies, and they're being fed lies in an emotional manner, so they react to it. We just need to continue fighting a vibrant democracy, which is not always an easy fight. But I want to reassure you that we're not losing. We need to continue fighting, but at the end of the day, Israel is a safe, secure, thriving democracy with equal rights to all its citizens. We are 125 years since the creation of the Zionist movement, and look at what we have achieved. The Jewish communities around the world are safer today because there is a Jewish state. That does not mean that on a daily basis life is easy or that we don't have challenges. But anti-Semitism is the most ancient hatred of all in the world. And it was actually Theodor Herzl who said to the elected officials in Europe that anti-Semitism is not a Jewish problem. It is your problem, he said to them, because when you have a growing anti-Semitism in your society, you should first and foremost be worried about the overall health in terms of rights and liberties of your people. Because when your people start attacking Jews, rest assured that more trouble is to come. And if you look at the woke reality and the cancel culture and the race theories that we are witnessing today, it was predecessed by an increase in anti-Semitism, not only in Europe, where we are used to seeing it, but also in North America. So I know it's not a comforting answer, but it's a philosophical answer that we need to continue fighting what is the longest hate in the world, while knowing that we already won. We have a state, and that state is not going anywhere.
Yeah, well, yes, amen to that. Now we'll take Peter. Peter, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Right, thank you very much. Okay, Olga, first of all, thank you very much for everything you're saying. It's very enlightening and that's very good. The question by Cheryl was along the lines of what I'm looking at as well. And what you have said is very interesting and very nice. But what you've been saying all evening is that these people, the people who are criticizing Israel and the Jews and being anti-Semitic, have no moral compass, and they'll say anything they want to say, and the louder they say it, the better, and they get all this money from the European Union and so on and so forth. Now, this is what I want to say and ask. Jewish people are not idiots, they're quite smart. And there are different approaches.
Peter, you need to get to your question, please.
Okay, there are different, thank you. There are different approaches to an issue. And what you're saying is we're being righteous, we're being good, we're pointing these things out to people. But I really believe, and this is the question, what is it that we can actually physically do to have an effect on these people? It can't be nothing. So what can we actually do?
So you're spot on, and we are doing it on different levels. I can tell you what we at NGO Monitor have been doing. We have dedicated the whole evening in sort of explaining the problem and the issue and the phenomenon, but we have spoken less about the impact that we have had, because NGO Monitor, and I'm only going to talk about our organization for a second, and then we can talk about the larger community and what we as a community can do. But we don't research just for the sake of research. We go to governments with two goals: to cut funding to these anti-Israel NGOs and to change NGO funding policies, meaning legislation, guidelines, how they vet them, and so on. And in the last 10 years alone, we have cut more than $80 million in funding to anti-Israel NGOs. Let that number linger with you, okay? We don't sit idly and we don't just publish reports. We take them and we take action. We have changed in the last 5 years NGO funding policies in 15 countries, including EU, and which has an overarching effect, right? Because EU it represents 27 governments. So when you pass a piece of law in the EU, it is a binding in 27 countries. I'm a firm believer that as opposed to them, the other side, we need to work with governments. We need to work the official channels, because we want whatever our impact is to be institutional. And that's what you can do too. You can write to your elected officials. You can alert them to these things. Most of the MPs are not aware because not everyone has been to Israel. This is to us, it is a central issue because we care so deeply and because it affects our lives daily. But to most of the MPs, this is a niche issue. In most countries, Jewish communities are small in numbers, so they don't even represent a large constituency, right? So they will deal with our issues in accordance to that. But if we alert them and we show that this is an electoral issue, and if you pick it up, you will get more votes, because it boils down to that, then they will do something. You can continue bringing experts, just like so many organizations in Australia, including AJA, are doing, to talk to your elected officials. You can train your young people, your students, to be able to have these discussions on campuses, so they don't sit in the corner when they're being attacked by NIF-supported NGOs and activists when Israel is being labeled as apartheid, or they're being called Zionist, racist activists. We need to continue the fight. We need to educate ourselves. We need to strengthen the Jewish identity, which is not to be disconnected from Israel. In Europe, for example, we see a growing trend where young Jewish people say, I'm Jewish and European, I have nothing to do with Israel. Gewalt, as we say. We must stop this trend. There's no way of disconnecting these things. So there's plenty of things we can do, and we most certainly need to be offensive, aggressive, smart about what we do, intelligent, laser precise, because we are not many and the resources are scarce. But we need to stay on the legal side of issues. That is my view, right? So we allow the other side to lose their moral compass. We should not do the same. We have been mandated by our forefathers to be the light unto the nations, and that also includes inside of the battle, right? Of the battlefield, whether it is a verbal one or the one in Gaza.
Thank you, Olga. Look, well, I've promised Robert a question. So, Robert, please unmute yourself and we'll just squeeze one last question in.
Yeah, just a quick question that's come through. Why doesn't Israel retaliate, like cut tax break for these groups, fund subversive groups in Europe, make a diplomatic incident with the European Union? Why don't they take stronger action to stop these anti-Israel NGOs?
It's $1 million question. I wish I knew. I can tell you that in the aftermath of the terror attack in which Rina Schnerb was murdered, in the first couple of months, when basically we ran an aggressive campaign in European capitals and all these things made significant waves in the European and Israeli and international media, the Israelis summoned European ambassadors for démarche and said, how is this possible? How is this? How can this be? We demand that you stop the funding. The Israeli ambassadors in European capitals have put this on the agenda and included this in their talking points. When the Israeli Ministry of Defense designated 6 NGOs, the Israeli Ministry of Affairs did have an aggressive campaign on this, and they were, and we saw that the European governments paused everything and they were deliberating what to do. Now, fast forward, you need to understand that the Palestinian side and the Palestinian NGOs ran a very aggressive counter campaign as well, because they were harmed on 2 grounds. First of all, a tremendous amount of money was cut for them. Only one of these groups, the UAWC, lost in a single moment $20 million annually from the Dutch government. Imagine how existential this is for these NGOs. But on the other account, they lost legitimacy. They were now being painted as a bunch of terrorists. Long term, this was a much more dangerous and damaging thing for them. So they embarked on a very aggressive campaign and they pulled their heaviest guns. They mobilized their entire support, and they have the support of the international human rights community, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch and a bunch of human rights activists, including some in the governmental lines, a lot of media. The overwhelming left-leaning media, from the New York Times, to leading papers around Europe, have sided with them, which created the pressure from the other side onto the European governments. So the Europeans, in their conversation with the Israelis, have been going back and forth. They said, okay, we are going to look at the evidence, and they just stalled the issue for over a year, sort of hoping that the whole issue will go away, because they dealt with it as if it was a hot potato, because they wanted to please the Israelis, but they also needed to please the other side, which was being very vocal, including voices from their own respective societies and leading voices, right? Now, the Israelis too, just like most other governments, the Israeli government is also not very versed in what to do with NGOs. For the Israelis, this was a security issue. And I think that the Israeli government underestimated the reaction, the international reaction to the designation of human rights NGOs, because it sounds bad. It sounds, here's a democratic state that is penalizing, right, and announcing a bunch of human rights NGOs to be terrorists. It sounds like news from a third world country, right? And I think that the Israeli government didn't know how to deal with it because for them it was a security issue. So I think it is an ongoing learning curve also for the Israeli government, and we're taking a lead role there as well in working with the Israeli members of the Knesset. They need to take a more vocal stand on making sure that their counterparts understand that it's not just it's a security issue, but it's a political issue, and that is the core of the problem. That until the Europeans and the Israelis agree, and I don't know when that will be, that Palestinians are running a politicized and political campaign delegitimizing Israel, and that they're using the NGO network to run that campaign, I'm not sure that we will see the end of this issue. So we have made significant progress, but we're not there yet. We need to continue in exposing the true colors of these groups. They are hiding behind big words such as human rights and humanitarian, but they are radical, hateful, discriminatory, and inherently anti-Semitic, because while they portray themselves as criticizing Israel and occupation, they are basically saying one simple thing: we are against Israel as a Jewish state. That's what it is.
Yeah, yes, that's very true. Look, we have gone a little bit over time, so Olga, thank you so much for joining us. There's very clearly a blurred line between civil society and terrorism, but thanks to you and thanks to NGO Monitor, you're making the points very loudly and clearly. So we thank you for that, and we thank you for joining us on our Zoom session tonight. So kol hakavod to you all there.
Thank you so much for having me and for inviting me. It is always an immense pleasure to interact with the Australian Jewish community. And thank you so much for all your support to Israel. We really, really appreciate that.
Good. Thanks, Olga. Just before we go, the L'chaim program with Morris Klein is on right now at 3ZZZ. But that's all we have for tonight. Don't forget, you can keep up to date with what AJA is talking about on our Facebook page. So please like it and share it widely. But for now, we wish you all a very good evening and look forward to seeing you next week as usual. So from me, it's good night to you all. Bye for now.